There are buildings like this all over the world, and they are known for what is taught inside. It's in churches where this Word of God is taught as truth and a way of life. Matter of fact, this Word of God is often revered as flawless and perfect, and even claims to be so. One passage says that the Word of the Lord is flawless, and another passage says that all Scripture is breathed out by God. But how can this be so given all that we've discovered in the world? Matter of fact, questions come to mind like, hasn't this been refuted by science? Is there anything in the historical record to support what it says? And maybe the best question of all, how can this be the Word of God when it's written by sinful men? As believers, we need to know if we can trust this to be the Word of God. This series is about answering the tough questions so that we can find out, is it possible to have faith in God without checking our brains at the door?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to GraceLife. Who's glad to be here? Come on, this is your first time back, like in a long time, right? You're a little more excited than that, I hope. So anyway, hey, before we go any further, I want to say hello and welcome everybody, especially any guests that we have with us. So glad to have you worshiping with us today. And also want to say, before you come to a worship service next weekend, I want to go ahead and make sure you know, check the times before you come. There's a good chance that we're going to need to make some adjustments to best meet the needs of our church family this coming week. And I'd hate to have you in the parking lot when we're not here, and I would hate to be here in an empty room again. I did that for like 3 months. I don't want to be alone in here again. So let's make sure we're all here at the same time. Well, today we're kicking off a new series, one that I am very excited about. You've been hearing hints about it through our last couple of series. We've been planning this for over a year, and talking with my friend Darrell here for over a year about doing the research for this and helping out to make this happen. This series is simply called The Bible. And the reason for that is because I'm just going to read it to you. I'm glad somebody found that funny. Literally, the other service, only Kent laughed. Like, they didn't. I think they thought, oh my gosh, is he really? Okay, no, I'm not. I'm not going to just read the Bible to you. What this series is about is how we have some difficulties sometimes with some of the things that are in the Bible, or what some other people tell us about the Bible in light of science or history, and we've maybe been given the idea that some of the things that we think are in the Bible are not true or couldn't be true, maybe as far as to say there couldn't be a God. And so there are a lot of difficulties that sometimes we come across, even to the point that some of us would think there's a choice between having faith or having intelligence. And so I spent over 10 years as a school teacher, over 10 years as a youth pastor, and I've seen a lot of people either struggle with their faith or leave their faith altogether because they didn't have good answers to some difficult questions or some debates or so forth out there. And so anyway, as we started talking about doing this series, I met with Darrell, I think on a totally different topic, and said, hey, I'm excited about this. And as I got to know a little bit more about Darrell, I asked him if he would be my research assistant. And as he went away and began preparing the research and putting things in order, I very quickly figured out that him being my research assistant was a joke because he's brilliant. So let me tell you a little bit about Darrell here. He has spent over 40 years as an engineer and a scientist, actually retired from his last position as the chief science officer of that organization. And I realized I could just stand up here and try to look really smart reading some of the stuff that he had given me to make these claims or cases or whatever. And then, I thought it'd be a lot better if we just sat down and had a conversation. It's a whole lot easier for me to ask a question and let you answer it, since you actually understand all this. In addition to 40 years in this field, it's also just a personal hobby and passion of his. Would you guys all help me welcome Darrell Mordente to the stage today?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And so as we get into this, we're going to start out kind of in the shallow end of the pool and just address the idea that science has actually proven that faith is a crutch. It's not a real thing, that there's not actually a God, and science has gone as far as to prove that. Is that correct?
Absolutely not. Not only has science not disproven the existence of God, science is not capable of doing that. And the basic reason for that is that science is concerned with the study of natural phenomena, natural laws, the laws of science they're referred to. It is not concerned with the supernatural, really. It's the natural laws that it studies. When you do hear from time to time certain atheist scientists claim that they have now disproven the existence of God, they have moved out of the realm of science and they're into the realm of philosophy, humanistic atheism in particular.
So what about a very famous debater, scientist who has claimed to do so by the name of Richard Dawkins? I think everybody would bring that name to mind.
Right. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist. He is also an activist atheist, and by that I mean he has a gospel he wants to preach, atheism. He wrote a book called The God's Delusion, and in that book he basically claimed that the concept of God is something that came about through evolutionary happenings in the human mind, and that this concept of a God is a total delusion, a crutch needed by some that we need to overcome. In response to him, another very famous mathematician by the name of David Berlinski, who is not a Christian, not a believer, he is an agnostic bordering on atheism, wrote a book in response. His book he called The Devil's Delusion. And I want to read from you a short quote of what he said about the idea of science disproving the existence of God. Has anyone ever provided proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is even here? Not even close. Have the scientists explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything as long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophies justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on.
Wow. So, to be clear, that is an agnostic who is leaning towards an atheist, rebutting another atheist, and that's what he has to say about scientific study claiming to prove there's no God.
That's right.
Okay, so is he just a strange outlier out there? He's all alone in this kind of an opinion?
No. There's another another evolutionary biologist and an atheist, Stephen Jay Gould. He, as I said, is an atheist, but I like to say at least he's an honest atheist on this issue. And he doesn't believe that science could disprove the existence of God. And this is what he wrote. Science tries to document the factual character of the natural world and to develop theories that explain these facts. Religion, on the other hand, operates in the equally important but utterly different realm of human purposes, meanings, and values, subjects that the factual domain of science might illuminate but can never resolve.
Okay, so all of those that you've mentioned so far are atheist or agnostic, and so that kind of gives us the idea that that is the scientific community out there. Are there actually Christians in the scientific community?
Yes, there are numerous Christians in the scientific world that are dedicated to science, pursuing science, engineering, that are also professing believers, and there have been through centuries. But even more important than that fact is the fact that science itself, the modern scientific method, owes its very existence to Christian philosophy. And that is outlined in this book here, The Soul of Science by Nancy Pearcey. In this book, she makes the case she shows you when the scientific method actually got developed. Ancient Rome, the Egyptians, the Chinese, they all had very interesting technologies, very amazing technologies, but none of them developed the scientific method. The scientific method wasn't developed until about the 1600s, and it was developed in Western Europe. Interestingly, that was occurring right after the Bible started getting written in the common languages of the day, and more people could see what it says. At any rate, the scientists, men interested in science at that time, I got to take it back a little bit to help you understand this. Forget about your cell phones, forget about your airplanes, your automobiles, and all the technology, your lights that switch on and off, all that stuff, and try to transport yourself back to 1600. In that time frame, we had no understanding of modern science. Electricity was a lightning strike. That's all we had. We didn't even have batteries. Our concepts of the law of gravity hadn't been discovered yet. Laws of motion were thoroughly misunderstood. But men reading in the Bible, reading what the Bible had to say about God, realized that God was a God of order and that he created a universe of order and that he governed that universe. And if he governed it, there must be laws of nature by which he governed them. And so they said they'll put their faith in that those exist, and they'll put their time and energy and money and effort into studying that in the hope that they could figure out what those laws actually were. They did that, and that modern method is called the scientific method. It works like this. I'm sure you've heard it in your high school classes probably. You make observations, you then make a theory, and then you test the theory. That's the basic modern scientific method. Developed early in the 1600s. It is used today by all kinds of scientists, whether they're atheists or not. So you have, who are some of these men? You have Kepler and Newton are two of the names I could mention. Kepler was an astronomer who took very precise measurements of the orbits of planets and figured out that it was really the Earth and the planets that were orbiting around the sun rather than everything else orbiting around the Earth. Was he a Christian? Okay, well, let me use this. This is what he wrote in one of his notebooks. He just burst out spontaneously in prayer and wrote this in. I give you thanks, Creator and God, that you have given me this joy in thy creation. And I rejoice in the works of your hands. See, I have now completed the work to which I was called. In it, I have used all the talents you have lent to my spirit. He saw his calling to be a scientist, and he didn't see it at all inconsistent with being a Christian believer. Isaac Newton is the man who developed calculus, developed the law of gravity, the laws of motion that we use to send men to the moon and back. This is what he wrote about the solar system. This most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. His understanding of science, which was revolutionary, did not in any way put him off from his belief in God. He did not have to check his brain when he entered the church.
And to me, that's what's significant, because if, say, Richard Dawkins were to come in here and challenge us, and even if it were debate looking at history, he would probably say, so what that some Christians went in search of science and became scientists? What's the big deal to that? And it is significant, actually, that Christians went looking for an orderly universe as a result of an orderly God that created that. And
revealed in the Bible.
They found what they thought was that evidence. What to me is significant is that those quotes, because as those Christians became scientists, they became stronger Christians.
Right.
And the idea that we have today of the scientific world versus the Bible is that it is science versus the Bible, which is not actually the case at all, but that's the idea that's given to us.
Right.
And so we believe that if anybody were to venture into intelligence and science and facts, that they would by default lose their faith because the evidence would be so overwhelming. What's amazing to me is that as these men and women throughout history have gone into the scientific field, that their faith has increased and been strengthened.
Right.
And are there others?
Yeah, you could, if you were to Google list of Christians in science and technology, you would find a list of hundreds of men and women down through history that have been mathematicians, scientists, engineers, that have made major discoveries in science. Lord Kelvin, who developed the first and second law of thermodynamics, all the way down to modern days James Tour, who is a leading nanotechnology engineer. All of these people, devout Christians.
And so just like you, they are able to go to work in the scientific field Monday through Friday, and they have, in many cases, PhDs in their field.
Yes, absolutely.
And then they're able to come to church on Sunday and not believe that that is a contradiction, that they're not having to choose one over the other.
Absolutely. They are making great strides in the development of science and our understanding of the natural world, and in no way does that conflict with their religious beliefs.
Okay, so that was the easy stuff. Let's jump into the deep end of the pool, because I think what anybody watching who has wanted to object, if they wanted to object, this would be their objection at this point. There is something out there in the scientific world that flat out says this is the way and the Bible's way is wrong. The Bible has an answer to how we came to be, how the world came to be, the universe, people, everything. The Bible has a version, and then there's a scientific theory that is taught as the leading theory, if not the accepted version of truth. And this person who created a theory, their name reigns in the scientific world. And so today, since our topic today is Has Science Refuted the Bible? Most people who would go to science class and hear this theory and see this taught written in a book would say, absolutely, absolutely, science has refuted the Bible. So we just need to go ahead and address the elephant in the room, a man named Darwin, and his version of how we got here. So what do you have to say about Darwin and his theory?
Okay, so Charles Darwin, I'm sure we all heard the names, as you said, wrote a book, The Origin of Species, in 1859, and basically he laid out a theory, I'll call it a theory, laid out a theory of how simple life, what he considered to be simple life, evolved to complex life like human beings. Fundamental to the operation of his theory, fundamental things that he believed, was that this occurred through random mutations and chance. He was trying to eliminate God from this whole process. Random chance, lots of time, natural selection, and then there'd be a whole lot of fossils. Now we're going to go through each of those elements because I'm going to show you why they fail, and then later I'm going to tell you again why modern science doesn't even accept Darwinian theory anymore.
Okay, so let's pause right there.
Yes.
Because I like to call you out on this.
Yes.
And make sure everybody here understands you know the gravity of that statement.
Yes.
That as a reputable scientist yourself, and people who know you and the organizations you've worked for, and your career was not insignificant by any means. And you know this is recorded, this is broadcast, it's on the internet, not just as a one-time play. It's out there to be found by anybody who wants to argue. And you are going on the record as saying that modern science does not accept Darwinian evolution.
Yes, and I'm going to show it to you in their own writings.
Okay.
But first we'll talk about why they don't. What's the problem with it? And the first thing we're going to take a look at is random chance. Does random chance work? And we're going to talk about the formation of a simple protein, okay? Our bodies are made up of proteins, plant and animals all made up of proteins. I'm going to show you how a protein is formed. Now, a protein consists of amino acids. They are just an organic chemical, an organic molecule. There's only 20 of them that exist in nature. But each protein is made up of a certain sequence. They got those different 20 different amino acids have to show up in a certain sequence to make a particular protein. So if I can see the figure for a moment, we're going to talk about something called RNase A.
So before you go any further,
yeah,
if people are shaking out
yes.
there are people having triggers from like middle school science class and the horrible memory that was in your life and so forth. And some of you are thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be just miserable. I just want to stop for a minute and let you know we know what we're doing, in the sense of we know we're about to get nerdy for a moment. We know that. And we're going to do our best to keep it engaging and make it understandable. But there's a reason we're doing this, and the reason is very simple. You go to church and you hear a story about a guy named David. It's easy to remember. It's not complex, and you're good, and you go out of church inspired, and then you go to science class, and I really hope as we do this series that the current students are paying attention, or some of you went to science class long ago, or you watch a documentary, you read an article, and it's filled with facts, theories, scientific nerd stuff, and you don't know how to combat that, and you just walk away thinking they're right. Science has won, the Bible is wrong, but I still like to go to church. And you just think you've got to live a contradiction. So because what you're being given is some nerd information to say the Bible isn't true, we're going to give you a little bit of nerd stuff. And So the three nerds in the room about to have a lot of fun. The rest of you, I'm just going to ask you, try not to go back to science class in your mind and freak out, because this actually is engaging. We've done this enough times now. So let's keep going, and you're going to make sense of all this, and everybody's going to relax.
Okay, and this example was put together for me by a friend of mine, Dr. Carl Kruger, who's a microbiologist himself, a research scientist, and he put this together for me. But anyway, as I said, a protein is made up of amino acids in a certain sequence.
One protein that is microscopic.
They're microscopic. They're teeny tiny pieces of a cell. So if we look at this very simple RNase A, which has 156 amino acids in a string, let's look at we can actually calculate what the probability of this having come about by a random process. Now, what you're seeing on the screen is that string of letters. Each one is representing one of the 20 different types of amino acids, and they have to come in exactly that order, okay? So if we can calculate what that probability is. So if we look at, let's say we start off with an M amino acid, we need an A, okay? The chances of, by random process, of an A joining the M is 1 chance in 20, because there's only one A in the 20 amino acids. So 1 chance in 20 to get an M and an A. Then we want to look at, well, now we got the M and A, we need the L. What's the chances of the L joining the M and A? Well, it's 1 in 20 also. And to get that probability, you multiply the two together. 1 in 20 for the A, 1 in 20 for the L, 1 in chance in 400, just to get those three together. You can probably see where this is going. If you look at the fourth letter, the E, got to multiply the 1 in 400 times the 120 again. It's 1 chance in 8,000. Now, if we continue this calculation all the way through, we find that the probability of this occurring is 1 chance in 20 to the 155th power. Now, this number is so incredibly tiny, it is basically telling you there's no way in the world this can happen. But to try to give you some sort of an example, let's imagine this. So, Jimmy, if I were to take this quarter, which is about 1 inch in diameter, and the distance from the Earth to the sun is about 93 million miles, and if I were to take this quarter and a bunch of other quarters and line them up on a path from the Earth to the sun,
93 million miles.
93 million miles away. Just 1 inch at a time. 93 million miles away we're going to go. And I were to say to you, Jimmy, I have this path now from here to the sun, and it's all full of quarters, and there's one quarter that I painted red, and what I want you to do is climb in your handy-dandy little rocket ship, and blindfolded, I want you to fly along this line from here to the sun, and I want you blindfolded to pick out the quarter that I painted red.
And
Do you think there's much of a chance of you doing that?
There's no chance of me doing
that. There's no chance of doing that.
Actually, there's exactly 1 in 20 to the 155th power.
No, there's not even, it's not even.
I was paying attention.
No, it's not even that good. No. Your probability of picking out that quarter is much, much better than that 1 chance in 20 to the 155th power. Your chance of picking that out is about 6 chances in 10 to the 12th power.
That sounds easy.
The 20 to the 155th, that's like 10 to the 200th power. In order to make the probability comparable, and you've seen how ridiculous it would be for you to try to pick out that quarter, to try to get down to the probability of this protein coming about by random processes, we would have to have not one path of 6 trillion quarters. We would have to have 1 trillion paths of quarters. In fact, that wouldn't be enough. We'd actually have to have 1 trillion times 1 trillion times 1 trillion times 1 trillion about 12 times before we could get to how minute the probability of that protein forming by random chance.
And blindfolded, find one quarter.
And you got to pick through all those trillions of paths and find the 1 quarter in the path that has 6 trillion quarters in it. That's how small the probability is. It ain't going to happen.
So even for those who got lost in science class somewhere along the way, we can follow the math. That's called impossible.
Yes.
And we also need to highlight again, you're not talking about the probability of a cell turning into a human. You're simply talking about one protein coming into existence.
Just a little protein, of which there are many, many, many proteins in any given cell.
So he's got to repeat that process
again and
that
again and again.
chance, multiplied times that chance.
Again and again and
To
again.
even come up with a cell.
Again and again and again.
And okay, so what
Ain't
else?
going to happen.
All
Okay,
right, that's not
so
gonna happen.
that's for random chance, okay? These proteins did not come about by random chance, which Darwin said they did. Okay, we'll do time now. Is there enough time? All right, there's a Hubert Yockey. Hubert Yockey was a physicist. He worked in the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. He made a calculation of how long it would take for one gene in your DNA, just one gene, not the whole DNA, just one gene, how long it would take for that one gene to come about through a random process. And his calculation was 100 billion trillion years. That was what he calculated, 100 billion trillion years. Now, let's give Darwin the benefit of the doubt. Some people would believe that the Earth has been around or the universe has been around for 6,000 to 10,000 years, but we're going to be as generous as we can possibly be for Mr. Darwin's sake. And we'll take and consider the age that modern science believes that the universe is, which is just shy of 14 trillion years, 14 billion years, 14 billion years.
So 100.
So 100 billion trillion years is what Yockey said he needed to develop just one gene, and we only got 14 billion years to work with.
In best case scenario.
Mr. Darwin's out of time.
He's out of time.
He's out of time. Okay, so we've eliminated time.
Probability is not there either.
And the randomness doesn't work either. Okay. So now we're going to go to what Darwin really needed, which was transitional forms, fossil records. Because what Darwin said is supposed to happen is that animals are supposed to evolve from simple to complex through very, very slow changes. Many intermediate transformational forms until you got to the next animal. Okay, so I'll show you a picture of the Archaeopteryx. The Archaeopteryx, this is a bird-like animal that we found some fossils of. It has feathers, but it also has some resemblance to dinosaurs. It's got some teeth in the bill, some other similarities to dinosaurs. The premise here is that this evolved from dinosaurs. There's a fair amount of controversy with that, even among the environmental biologists. But let me go back and tell you what Darwin said about these transitional forms. He wrote this in The Origin of Species, the book he published in 1859. He was very troubled by the lack of transitional forms. He said the number of intermediate varieties, his word for transitional forms or missing links, the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on Earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? This is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. The lack of the fossil record in his day troubled him very much for the theory that he was espousing. 160 years later, we're still not any better off. Let's go back to that picture of the archaeologist, of the Archaeopteryx, excuse me. And let me tell you what Darwin is saying. Darwin is saying, I've got a dinosaur, and then slowly, step by step, I'm going to get different transitional forms. Thousands of them should be appearing before this Archaeopteryx appears for his evolutionary process to work. Well, what we found in the fossil record is we got dinosaurs, yeah, and we got the Archaeopteryx. We got about 12 of those. But we do not have a single one of the thousands of intermediate forms that should be there. They're totally missing.
Or the thousands that should come from the Archaeopteryx to a bird.
To a modern bird.
Right.
Same way as also. So if you're just looking at the evidence there, and if you're not predisposed to forcing an evolutionary answer, what we're seeing is another creature.
So we do have a handful of these strange fossils that have been found.
Archaeopteryx, yes.
And so some scientists say these are the missing links.
Right.
And you go to science class and your science teacher tells you, but we've got missing links. We've found the missing links in Darwin's theory. And you go, oh, again, the Bible's wrong, Darwin is right. Mm-hmm. But you're saying these are not missing links at all because we're missing too many missing links.
What I'm saying is that the evidence for it is not there. The evidence is just not there. we should have seen thousands of intermediate forms in between, as you said, dinosaur and Archaeopteryx to the modern birds. And we don't have them. We got 12 of those. How can we find 12 of those? We can't find any of the others. That's a troubling problem. So, in addition to that, there is something called the Cambrian Explosion, okay? And basically, prior to about 540 million years ago, there was life on Earth consisted of bacteria. Lots of bacteria, they were around for quite a while. But about 540 million years ago, over a stretch of time of a few million years, which is small by evolutionary standards, nearly every form of phylum, which is a high-level classification of animals, well above species, nearly every body type, phylum, appeared in that Cambrian, at the beginning of that Cambrian explosion.
So just to
These
be
were
clear,
marine life.
The Cambrian explosion is where people are going to now, since they can't hang their hat on Darwin. Am I understanding what this is?
Well, they have observed the Cambrian explosion, and now they're looking at that and they're saying, "Ooh, we got some troubles with Darwin," because remember, Darwin is telling you that things needed to be changing slowly over time and gradually over time from these simple bacteria all the way up to modern man. But that's not what's happening. You're seeing nothing happen, and then along comes the Cambrian explosion, and then boom, all these animals appear.
So even atheist and Christian scientists acknowledge there is this event
Oh, absolutely.
in our history
Absolutely.
they call the Cambrian Explosion.
Absolutely.
That seems very similar to something recorded in the beginning of Genesis in my world.
It's more like a creation type event. Now, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that animals haven't evolved. I mean, we see animals evolving, different kinds of cattle we produce and different kinds of horses we produce. We've seen that.
Evolution is just change.
Evolution is change over time. So I'm not saying that God didn't somehow use an evolutionary process to bring about different animals. But what I am saying, I can't prove that he didn't do that. I don't espouse that theory, but I can't prove that he didn't do that. What I am saying is that it did not happen by random chance. Such a thing could not have happened apart from God. Now, that's called the Cambrian Explosion. It happened 540 million years ago. You move 300 million years later, the dinosaurs now show up in exactly the same kind of burst. And then towards the end of that Jurassic period, the first mammals begin to show up. So you're seeing these spurts are occurring, not this gradual change that Darwin have hypothesized. And that's what I mean by modern evolutionary biologists. I don't care if they're Christian or atheists, they do not believe in Darwinian evolution because it doesn't work. What they have put in its place is something called punctuated equilibrium. What they mean by that word equilibrium means nothing's happened, and then punctuated, something suddenly happens. New animal forms show up. And this was developed by Stephen Jay Gould, the honest atheist that I mentioned to you earlier.
Honest atheist.
Right. And here is his explanation. Now to understand this, you remember, he's an atheist, doesn't believe in God, can't allow for God to be in this process at all. He's got to believe in his God, which is evolution, godless evolution. But here's his explanation of how evolution works. The rapid appearance of species, referring to things like the Cambrian explosion, the rapid appearance of these species, plus the lack of transitional forms, I haven't got none of those transitional forms, means that evolution works in spurts for unknown reasons and leaves little or no evidence.
So, some evolution, no evolution, suddenly.
Yeah, right. Static, nothing like Darwin would explain. And even worse than that, it leaves no evidence for them, and they have no reason, unknown reasons on why this happens. And that's what they hold to. That's what modern evolutionary biologists buy into, is they look at this. And they will, even though in your public high schools or in your PBS, Nova shows, NPR, they're going to sing the praises of Darwin to the public. In private, this is what they will admit to.
Right. Okay, so when you brought your research to me, I thought all of this was awesome, fun. I'm a little bit of a nerd, and it was engaging. And then you brought up one thing, And to me, that one thing is the mic drop moment. Like when you see this, you're just done. I don't know how anyone sees this and tries to continue saying that science has refuted the Bible. And so I'd like us to just close with your mic drop moment that you've got here. Tell everybody about this illustration, except it's not. It's what's happening.
Right. Okay, it's a concept called irreducible complexity, and the term comes about from the idea that it challenges Darwin's idea. Darwin's idea was that you'd have species-to-species development transitioned by having small random mutations in a body that provided some advantage, had to provide an advantage, and then you have another small, maybe 100,000 years later, another random mutation, and that would give you a little bit of an advantage, and survival of the fittest would allow this thing to go along. There's a Dr. Behe, he is a biochemist from Lehigh University. He wrote this book called Darwin's Black Box, and what he's referring to by the term black box, what he means is that for Darwin, we didn't have the scientific instruments that we have today. So a cell, a single cell, to him was just a bunch of protoplasm, something like a jelly bean. That was his idea. So
That's why these are here. They're not just for our snacking, but it's an illustration.
Yes, exactly. So that was what he thought of, and that's why he could say, well, simple life form going to complex life forms as human beings. What we actually know today, though, is that the cell is an extremely complex manufacturing facility, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there are things that exist in the cells that defy the idea of gradual evolutionary changes by mutation, a little bit of extra benefit in each little part coming together. And I want to show you one of the examples of that, and this is a flagellum motor. You probably saw this in high school class, your biology class in high school. You saw they talk about a little single-celled animal called the flagellum, and he had a little tail, and he swam around. Well, since 1973, scientists have actually known how that little tail works, and it works with this complex electrochemical motor, more complex than anything man has ever tried to design. And what you're looking at, this is not a picture of a motor. It doesn't look like a motor. This is a motor. This is a motor. You will see the stator, for those of you who know the stator, the white rings on the outside. And the inside is the rotor that actually does the spinning. The white object going up is the drive shaft, up to the bent object, which is a universal joint that can wiggle or reshape in different directions to steer this thing, and then the long tail, which is a propeller. You also have all the bushings. All of these things are made up of different kinds of proteins, the bushings that keep this motor in the cell wall of the flagellum bacteria. I'm not even going to discuss all the control mechanisms that are used to operate this. This motor is incredibly phenomenal, spins at about 100,000 RPM, and can reverse itself in a quarter of a turn. These are. As an engineer, I would love to have designed something like this. That would be fantastic. I'd be very wealthy now had I been able to do that. The point, though, that I want to make, why is this thing so important, is because all of those parts in that motor have to come together at the same time in order for there to be any benefit whatsoever to this bacterium. You can't have just a stator. That doesn't do anything. You can't have just a drive shaft. That doesn't do anything. You can't have just the tail. All of those parts had to come into existence simultaneously before there is any benefit to that bacteria at all, before it has a working motor. And that violates the fundamental premise of Darwinian evolution and any other godless evolutionary theory.
So, first of all, let's make sure everybody understands, because you are an engineer, and that does look like a drawing of something that you built somewhere, that is microscopic.
Right.
It's inside of a bacteria.
Right.
As well as you said, there are more in other cells in our body and more motors and so forth. what blows my mind, first of all, when you see that, how do you keep thinking that we are gooey masses like jelly beans? I had a science teacher who said the cell is like a jelly bean. We all have jelly beans, and that's why we've got them here today. And it's a jelly bean with a tail, and that's why it can change its information because it's this gooey mass. And as of 1973, we could see that it was not a gooey mass, that existed.
Right.
And so a couple of concerns come to mind. The first one is up until 1973, I mean, Darwin ruled the world for over a century, and maybe still does in some circles. And he had no clue what he didn't know because he couldn't see. We didn't have microscopes powerful enough to see this until 1973. And so, we're saying we know, contrary to what God has told us to believe, based on science. And then we find out in 1973 with the invention of microscope and power,
specialized microscopes, electron microscopes.
that we find out we know things we've never known.
Exactly.
And then we're still finding out things about
Right.
robots inside of us.
Every day.
And so it blows my mind that we think we can say we know it all.
Right.
And we clearly are still discovering things. I just read an article yesterday, about some astronomers discovering some lighted rings or something, and they don't know what it is yet. And the point is, we're still coming across discoveries, and yet we are ready to emphatically say what we think we know and try to erase God from that. But the real issue for me, and I'd like you to speak to, is they've known the flagellum motor existed since 1973.
Yes.
Just for the fun of it, that means my entire educational career. Elementary school, middle school, high school, college. And for those that don't know, I did want to be a doctor for a period of time, which meant I took a lot of biology, chemistry. I enjoyed science. And I was never taught about the flagellum motor in any class ever,
Right.
even though the scientific community knew it existed.
Yes.
I was taught
Yes.
the jelly bean theory
Yeah.
of Darwin. How is it that a theory you say that modern evolutionary biologists no longer believe?
Is there something else I can help with?
My iPad just freaked out, sorry. How is it if they no longer believe it, if we can see clearly evidence to the contrary, why is this still being taught? Why is this, to many young children coming home from 7th grade, 5th grade, 9th grade, whatever the level is, why are they still being told that Darwin has undermined this utterly and completely, and that we have, a missing link or two to prove it?
Yeah. Well, just as we would like to share the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world, there are those who would like to share the gospel of atheism to the world. I'm old enough to remember a time in which you could discuss God in the schoolroom, but laws have been changed that deny us that privilege. So that's part of the problem. But I'm going to read to you a little bit about another quote from these folks that maybe will give you some insight into that. But before I do that, I want to expand just a little bit more. This motor that I'm showing you is only one example of many. Your cells contain motors that are spinning at 6,000 RPM that produce energy for your muscles to move. As I'm talking right now, hundreds of those motors in every cell of my body are spinning at 6,000 RPM, producing the energy for me to move and talk, for my heart to beat. There are timers. There are walking robots, molecular robots, walking along, doing all kinds of functions inside your body. And when we finish this series, we're going to have a list of resources, and on that you'll see a very short 3-minute video. It was an animation put together for Harvard University's chemistry department to encourage young people to get involved in chemistry, and you will see an animation of these different kind of robots functioning in the cell. It has to be an animation because you can't put a camera inside of a cell. Maybe one day we will, but we can't do it yet. So it's an animation. I called up a friend of mine, a doctor in microbiology, just to double check, and I sent him the link, and I said, is this all real? Or this walking robot that I'm seeing here, transporting waste out of the human cells, is that real? And he says, absolutely. And in fact, he sent me a paper that he and some of his colleagues had just recently published, showing another robot that they had discovered and an animation of how it worked. So there is lots of this evidence that exists and is known in the scientific world. But there are...
To be clear, because I don't know that we have said it as clearly in this service, this evidence points to what?
These are things that could not come about through random chance, which is a fundamental premise of Darwinian evolution. That's why Darwinian evolution is really not accepted by modern biologists. Some of them still cling to random chance. They do not want to accept the idea of a God intervening into the development of life. They refuse to accept that. And I'm going to read you a quote.
Because this type of design does point to a designer.
If I look at this watch, I can tell you this thing did not evolve. This was designed. Okay, you look at that motor, and I defy anybody to tell me that that thing was not designed. It did not come about through an evolutionary process. That's clear. Now, I've mentioned the book Darwinian or Darwin's Black Box. If you go online and you look up this, you're going to find a court case which allegedly refuted Dr. Behe in his book. And I want to just mention very quickly, if I can, what the story behind that is. There were some folks that were trying to get intelligent design, which is what Dr. Behe really birthed the idea of intelligent design as a way to explain certain biological things we see in nature, like the motor. And they wanted to get that taught in the public school systems alongside of Darwinian evolution. They just wanted it taught as an alternative theory. They were challenged in court. The opponents brought in their own biologist. They got themselves a judge who was inclined to go with Darwinian evolution. They did a lot of hand-waving. I've looked at the details. I don't have time to go through the details. I could explain to you later. But there was a lot of hand-waving, circular arguments, and the bottom line is the judge, of course, decided in favor of the Darwinian evolutionists. No intelligent design is going to be allowed in our public school systems. Now, this is a final quote here is from a biologist, Franklin Harold. He wrote this in The Way of the Cell. These are books that only biologists read. In 2001, he wrote, in response to Darwin's Black Box, Dr. Behe's book, he wrote, "We should reject as a matter of principle the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity." They want to believe in chance and necessity rather than what's obviously been intelligently designed. But we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations. That's the extent of what science understands about godless evolution in the world of biology.
So that is, to wrap up today, the reason we're doing this series. If you guys will put that quote back up, because what hit me as we were reading this, and the emphasis is either mine or Darrell's in this case, I underlined the phrase, as a matter of principle. What that means is they look at the flagella motor, but as a matter of principle, they would not suggest an option of a designer for such a design. It's just principle.
Reject it.
And the reason we're doing this series is because I think most of us do, come into the world with a naivety and innocence. You go to school and believe every teacher is morally upstanding and speaks only unequivocal truth and so forth, and you believe that about every news source and everything. And the truth is, it doesn't take very long before we figure out that every human has a worldview, politics, faith, no faith. They have experiences of grandmothers that took them to church, or fathers that dragged them to church but were abusive, and so they hate God. I mean, every human. We actually had a quote we didn't include because we didn't think there would be time, of a scientist saying that there's no such thing as a scientist without a bias. Right. But we like to think, as we go into our science class and a science teacher says something, that is empirical truth and it's just there. But what we need to understand is that there are scientists. And some of those scientists are Christians. And some of those scientists are agnostic or atheists. But as we see in this quote, as a matter of principle, there are also atheists who have a day job of science.
Right.
Meaning that their first agenda is to make sure that a door is never opened to faith.
Yes.
And even in light of any evidence that seems to make it clear that a godless theory, and when we say godless theory, it means without God. So a theory like Darwin's evolution, that we're going to hold on to that, and we're going to excuse the idea of a designer
Right.
simply because they are an atheist, first and foremost. And yet, because they have PhDs in biology or astrophysics or chemistry or whatever, they get to write articles in scientific journals.
Right. And they get paid to do that. And they have a lot of their reputation. The older ones have a lot of their reputation invested in this form of evolutionary thinking. And so for them to reverse their position after decades is unthinkable for them to do. Some of the younger biologists that are coming up now are looking at these Darwin theories, these random chance stuff, and they're going, this doesn't work. This is not working. And that's really what Dr. Behe discovered. As he was looking at this, he's saying, this isn't working.
So where we're going to leave you today is, first of all, knowing there are 3 more parts of this series. Darrell's going to be back next week as we leave biology and touch on a completely different scientific area. And then I'm going to do 2 more parts of the series looking at history and archaeology and some other, I think, interesting things. But we want to leave you today with really 2 thoughts. First of all, if you're a believer, I want you to know that you no longer have to hang your head in shame when you show up in an intelligent setting. Just because you don't know everything Darrell knows, what you do need to know is that this information exists. You can go find it, you can do the research if you ever intend to get into a debate, but most importantly, I've watched a lot of Christians just believe they're somewhat dumb because of their faith, and they just walk away or hang their head. And especially students who will maybe even make the opposite choice, and that is to walk away from their faith and choose to represent themselves as intelligent. What I want to say to believers is you no longer have to choose between intelligent and faith. Matter of fact, the 2 go hand in hand,
Yes,
actually.
Yes,
and
they
some
do.
of the smartest people
Yes, they do.
today, as well as all throughout history,
Yes.
had great faith.
Yes.
And then what I want to say secondly to those who are yet to be believers, potentially, because you thought, wait a minute, I don't want to be one of those dumb Bible Belt believers who ignores the facts that are out there. And as a result, you have chosen not to make Jesus Christ your King. I just want to challenge you to reconsider that in light of what you've begun to hear today. And again, we can only scratch the surface today. I mean, you would have liked to go for like 10 hours
That'd be great.
with all the stuff that you know, and we just can't do that. So our goal today was to give people introductions so that they can go and do more research for those who care, and for all of you at the very least to know there are scientists all over the world who go to work and then go to church and do not believe it's a contradiction.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because what they see in the scientific world actually strengthens their faith.
Absolutely.
You being one example.
Yeah, I'm an example, and better examples than me. Francis Collins, who directed the whole genome project that mapped the human genome, dedicated man of science. He's a strong Christian believer. Just one example. There are many, many others.
Let me pray for everybody as we close today. God, I first want to pray for all of us who are believers and have struggled to have faith and to have faith proudly, because we think someone would look down on us and say, you believe that dumb stuff? Don't you know? And today, God, I pray for anybody who has struggled that they will be able to boldly believe that there are answers for the tough questions. I pray that you will increase our faith because of what we've heard here today, as well as what we may go and continue to discover on our own, as well as throughout the rest of the series. And then I pray, God, for those who have yet to make Jesus their King, especially if it's because of some intellectual debate or argument that they've heard. What I'd like to remind everyone here of is that Jesus Christ came to the earth, lived a sinless and perfect life so that when he died, his blood could pay for your sins instead of his own. And then he was raised from the dead by the power of the Father, supernatural God that we'll be talking more about. And as a result of that, he can offer you resurrection from death in this life to eternal life. It's a free gift of salvation that simply comes with recognizing who he is and what he's done. And if you've never done that, I want to help you do that right now. Wherever you're seated or standing, wherever you are, watching online, anything, simply pray and say something like this to yourself and to God. Lord Jesus, I thank you that you died for me. And now, I want to live for you. I thank you that you love me. I thank you that I'm forgiven. And my simple prayer here today is that you give me a life of great meaning in your kingdom. Amen. Let's celebrate with those people, everybody. Amen.